Hello again, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Fun and Games Podcast. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I am Matt, a.k.a. Stormageddon.
And you're listening to episode 95. And this episode, we are joined by Dino Dvorabic, a designer, developer over at Big Blue Bubble Games. Dino, it's so great to have you on the show today.
Thank you for having me, guys. It's great to be here.
I'm so excited to have you on. And so a little bit of history with your latest game, Foregone, which is going to be the primary topic. Of course, we'll talk about other things as well. I first discovered Foregone pretty late, actually, into its development at PAX East this year. I can't believe that was this year. It feels like 10 years ago. But I met Michael at the booth, and I saw this game, and a friend of mine who works for Super Deluxe Gamescast, Matthew Finneman, was like, oh, you have to check out this game. It's in early access. It's amazing. You have to play it. And so I sat down and played it. And of course, I fell in love with it. Michael tells me that you might have actually been there, Dino. We might have actually spoken, but I will be completely honest. I can't remember.
Yeah, PAX East feels like it was so long ago at this point. I was there. We were running the booth the whole time there. We were next to 30XX, I think. Great guys there. It was awesome to see all the players come through and test out the game. You learn a lot just by watching people sit down and see how they experience it their first time through.
For sure, yeah. And I was kind of blown away. For those who don't know what Foregone is, Google it, but we'll tell you anyway. Foregone is this side-scrolling 2D action platformer and it's kind of like, feels like a Metroidvania, but it's more straightforward. There are like transportations, but you're kind of always moving in a forward momentum. It looks gorgeous. It's got incredible pixel art. I guess my first question, what was it like working on a game in early access? A lot of games do early access now, so they kind of gauge the interest of the players, figure out how they're going to build it out. How did that affect your development of the game? I'm sure it's a little more chaotic or a little more different than just a game that gets made and released.
Yeah, with early access, we had the opportunity to have people engage with it as well. So we had our Discord running the whole time. Anyone who purchased early access, they were in there. They could message us. I was always reading it. I've seen every single message in there. So anyone who posts still, I'm reading it. It's nice to see what people say and to be able to adjust things for what they were concerned about before we came out to release. We also do track, I think most game developers do track stats. So we were able to gather a bunch of stats early on, kind of address problem issues that we thought would not be the case. It was really nice to see what kind of things we could balance out before we actually released it to the public.
That makes sense. And it's interesting that, between early access, conventions like PAX East, you get a lot of, I don't want to call it free play testing because early access people are buying the game, but how do you compare the sort of feedback you get on a Discord server versus that very personal, I guess, or face-to-face feedback you get at bringing the game to a convention? PAX
East was interesting because you kind of see the onboarding experience. So that first part of the game and how people experience that. And I think several times throughout PAX East, I would turn to Michael and say, oh, we really got to fix this thing. It's way too long. People are struggling through it. The difficulty was too high. And that was one of the big ones. So as soon as we came back from PAX East, I made sure that we addressed that. The entire tutorial section has changed probably 4 or 5 times now, and that PAX East convention was critical for making that change actually happen.
That's awesome. And so I'm someone who got to play it at PAX East, and then of course, you guys were gracious enough to provide me with a copy of the game on Switch, and so I could prep for this interview and enjoy this game that I love. And what's really great, I guess hashtag sponsored. I don't know. The internet's weird. But what I really loved about getting to play it on Switch versus, I think it was running on a PC at PAX East, is that it works really great, even compact on the small screen. I think what's really beautiful about the pixel art is that it looks good at any size. It doesn't look blown out, and it also isn't unreadable at a small size. I'm curious, when designing the game, was 2D pixel art always the goal from the start, when even in the early concept stages, or did you guys kind of arrive at it like a lot of other games have in the past?
I think our goal initially was always to do the appearance of 2D. So the game isn't actually 2D pixel art.
Right.
It's all 3D aspects and stuff, 3D models with a 2D aspect ratio to it, I guess. You can see all the layers in our art posts that we have in one of the blogs. I think our art director does a big breakdown of how the game is presented visually. We always did want to make it pixel art looking. It was just figuring out how we implement that and how we make that work for our game specifically.
That makes a lot of sense. And I mean, it looks gorgeous. Like, I've shared tons of screenshots. Like, the dynamic. What I love about pixel art now, like you said, it's not actually 2D. It just looks 2D. It reminds me a lot of like Octopath Traveler, which was a big RPG release, that it had like those dynamic backgrounds along with 2D models or 3D models that look 2D. Like, I love that kind of depth perception. It almost feels like it's a trick, you know? And it makes the game look way more inviting and more lifelike.
Yeah, it also gave us a lot of flexibility in terms of what we can do with our character models. So if we want, you know, some guy to have a different weapon, it was very easy to just make that 3D model hold a different thing. And then we immediately already have a fully animated pixel art 2D character with a brand new weapon ready to go.
Yeah, you don't need to make an entirely new sprite sheet just because you wanted to put something new in their hands.
Absolutely.
The march of time. It can be wonderful.
I'm curious what kind of difficulties you found in development. Like you mentioned earlier, like after PAX East, you knew how to really focus in and change that tutorial. What are some other trip ups or like difficulties you had in the process? Was there anything that really was hard to wrap your head around or to kind of get out of the way? Or is it pretty much a smooth process?
One of our really big hurdles early on is we had this combat in place where we had our melee combo system, we had our enemies attacking, but absolutely nothing was challenging in terms of what you fought where and how. And we had our enemies kind of sparsely placed far apart. And then I think at one point we tried to create this kind of challenge room almost. So we turned all our battles into encounters, I guess. So you have high profile enemies that you need to deal with before you can actually go in and just clear everything out one by one as they kind of approach you. And that took a lot longer than I think most people would think. I think we had so many iterations of combat where it was just nobody was liking it. Everyone was really frustrated that it wasn't difficult. It took a while.
That makes sense. There's a certain je ne sais quoi about interacting with an environment or making the gameplay loop. And good design is always so tricky because if it's done well, you almost don't notice it. So I could see that being kind of a big deal, but you know, it shows in the game like that all that effort, you know, shines through. Now, Big Blue Bubble's done a lot more like mobile game development rather than like PC console game. Am I correct in saying that Foregone is like the first PC console release for the company?
I believe it is in recent years. I know before I was even at the company, they were making some console titles. I think a lot of it was work for hire. I think there's a Kung Fu Panda game on the DS there somewhere. There's a couple other older DS titles.
A storied pedigree.
All before my time. I started doing the mobile stuff as well. And then this is, I think for a lot of the team, this was kind of our first departure into the console platform and PC. We learned a lot of things on this one, especially early on. And hopefully these are all lessons that we can apply moving forward as well.
That's awesome.
Yeah. You don't get that kind of the same sort of feedback that you've been talking about with mobile game development, do you? Is there any sort of channel where there's not really discords for mobile games that I can think of? Maybe Genshin Impact does.
Right. I think it depends on the mobile game specifically. Some of them have very engaged communities. I know our title, My Singing Monsters, which is kind of our very big one, that has a pretty massive community. I think our team that works on that, they're pretty in tune with everything they have to say. They do listen to that feedback as well. It's definitely different than something like Foregone, which is, you know, a one-time purchase so we can develop what we need to, and then hopefully it's a one shot to get it perfect. But My Singing Monsters, they definitely do listen. There are changes to that game constantly based on the community.
I suppose the difference would be mobile games. Yeah, there is that expectation of update after release, sort of the more modern release style, whereas Foregone, it sounds like it's a lot of beforehand, early access, get the feedback early, and then it goes gold per se.
Yeah, we tried to make it as perfect as we could before we launched. Obviously, there's things that we do want to change, and we are working on updates. We will have released our December update by this point. We are working towards our Steam launch as well, which is no secret, I don't think. That Steam page has been up forever. Hopefully that will come with some additional changes in there. We are working on things. We'll see what we can get finished by that time.
That's awesome. I'm curious what it was like to develop across the multiple platforms. You know, I know that some indie developers have said that it's really easy to develop across platforms. Do you feel like that the base level of this game made it accessible for everything from PS4 to Xbox to Switch?
Since it was our first attempt at this, I think there was a lot of hurdles that we kind of expected, but we also just aren't prepared for initially. Our programming team, those guys are very talented. They spent a lot of time making sure this stuff all worked well. I think we had a couple of platforms where we had some performance issues, and just before the game's launch, we tried to make a close to day one update that tried to improve performance on everything. It got mostly there. I think it performs very well on each platform, hopefully. We'll see.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't had any performance issues on Switch, and unfortunately, the truth of the Switch is that as it's the least powerful of all the current gen consoles, well, I guess current gen is relative with the PS5 and the Xbox Series X 1070, whatever it's called at this point, being out now. But like that generation, a lot of like Bloodstained famously had a ton of issues in the beginning on the Switch. And so I always worry. I love my Switch, and ideally I want to play games on the Switch. And so I was really relieved that when I played Foregone, there were no latency issues. There were no graphical problems. It ran really smoothly. And I'm grateful for that, because you never know. I know that all of these platforms are not the same. It would be great if we had a universal tool, right, for everything, but that's not the case. Did you find that developing for the PC was the easiest, or was it easier for the consoles?
PC's definitely the easiest, just because it handles performance a lot better. But like you said, when we can get it running perfectly on the Switch, it's just a matter of getting it on the other platforms after that, since the Switch is kind of the minimum hardware target. Once it performs well on there, it's easy to bring it up to the other ones.
Yeah, it's kind of what I was figuring. It's like, okay, if you can get it working on, make it on the Switch, you can get it working anywhere else.
Let's talk a little bit about your background with games. Obviously, as someone who makes games, I assume you also play games. When you were a kid, did you play a lot of video games? Did you grow up playing games?
Oh, yeah. I think when I was 3, the first thing I ever played was probably Mario on the Nintendo.
Nice.
And from there, I was hooked immediately, asking my parents for video games no matter what. And what I ended up getting instead of a Nintendo was probably one of the Ataris early on. So it was disappointing graphically, but I still spent a ton of time just playing it. Eventually, I think I got a Super Nintendo with Super Mario on there, and then nonstop playing from that point on forward, I think.
That's awesome. Do you have a favorite early game, or a game that you would say kind of defined your influence on games?
I think it was when I managed to convince my parents to get me Mega Man X. I've probably spent an unbelievable amount of hours in that game, getting every single secret. I think I even had to call the Nintendo helpline at the time to figure out how to get one of the heart tanks. Nice. That was a charge that my parents probably didn't like on the phone bill.
I always forget the days of the Nintendo helpline.
Yeah, the idea that you have to pay to get a tip, where now we just have GameFAQs and Google, is always funny to me. And by now, when this episode is aired, we had an episode of Side Quest about Star Trek 25th Anniversary, where a friend of the show, Brock Wilbert, talks about how when he was playing that game, him and his grandfather would call the helpline, and like his grandmother flipped out when she saw all the charges. Like, what is this? What are you calling a Star Trek helpline for? What is all this?
What is this 1-900 number you're calling? What are you doing?
It's always fun to remember like certain things that haven't aged with gaming's growth. Would you say that Mega Man X, especially on Foregone, which is a similar kind of side-scrolling combat game, do you think Mega Man X informed your design decisions personally, like, or ideas or suggestions?
Yes, absolutely. When we initially were creating her moveset, one of the things that was in there was an air dash, and I was super excited for that. That's basically straight out of Mega Man X2, one of the power-ups you could get in that game. Our wall grab works exactly like the Mega Man X one, where you cling to the wall and then you slowly slide downwards. That's that was some fine tuning for me to make sure it works like that. I really wanted something similar there. I think even our slide is pretty close to the original Mega Man in terms of his movement, where he slides down across the screen. We use that in a similar fashion in some spots where you can go underneath specific platforms.
That's awesome.
Do you ever get a chance to kind of go back and play the games from your childhood? If you can, do you choose to?
I always want to, I think, but it's really hard to go back when there's so many great new titles coming out, especially now with things like Mega Man 11, which is just a better version of the classic Mega Man titles. So I think I would rather always just keep playing the newer titles than going back and replaying some classic ones.
That makes a lot of sense. A bold statement, though, to say that Mega Man 11 is the best Mega Man. I don't disagree. I think graphically and like mechanics wise, it's definitely really tight and really well made. I'll be hard pressed. Like you, I was obsessed with Mega Man X when it first came out. I remember it was one of the first Mega Man games where I was like, I need to get this. This is new. I need it. And I feel like that game series has had its ups and downs. Would you agree that Mega Man X7 is the worst game ever made in the history of games?
I wouldn't say maybe the worst. It was certainly a struggle to play it. I don't think I've completed that one.
One of the most easily accessible disappointments.
I remember when I saw that PS2 was getting a Mega Man X game, I was so excited. And then you spawn in as Axel, and I'm like, who is this guy? What the hell? Where's Zero? Where's X? Why am I playing as this guy?
I can't remember which level it was, but the one where it's whichever flying boss, and the opening part is over-the-shoulder 3D platforming on whatever flying platforms. I never made it past that screen, and I just went, well, this is stupid, and we're not doing this anymore. And I played Mega Man X4 again because I just needed to wash it off.
Yeah, that sounds about right. So Dino, with Foregone, something that I found really interesting, to go back to the game, is it has voice acting, and not all 2D sprite-based looking side scrollers have voice acting. Was that a conscious decision? Was that something you guys wanted from the beginning, was to have voice acting in the game?
So originally we were aiming for kind of an ambitious thing with almost no dialogue at all. And the voice acting, narration things came in much later. I think it was when people really wanted to delve deeper into the story, the dialogue became kind of a natural choice for it. Mm-hmm. And then we thought we would try to enlist voice actors as well. I think we actually have a studio that's slightly above us in the same building on the just a few floors up, and they are actually a voice acting studio. So we actually use their resource to try to hire some voice actors, and we found some great people, and it turned out for the best, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's something about an action game that has like the hero's narrative where the hero is kind of lamenting as they go. Like, it seems silly to think like in real life that you would just talk about what you're doing as you do it. But there's something about that magic in movie and video games where like the hero's like, well, I have to get to this thing now. I can't possibly be destroyed yet or whatever. And there's just a charm to it, I feel like.
Right. And that was my initial hesitation, I think. That charm took a bit to grow on me specifically. I was probably one of the holdouts for that voice acting, and I guess I was wrong in this case. Sometimes you just got to suck it up and accept that you're not right in every decision.
And sometimes you've got to try it out first before you get that feeling. And yeah, it's weird to find those points where realism kind of takes a backseat to connection. I often think of when the Batman Arkham games came out and detective vision was such a brilliant thing. And it was like, oh, this is how I can pretend to be Batman without having like a helper call me and be like, hey, did you notice that thing there? Hey, there's something going on there. Maybe you should try, and a little bit of narration. And why would Batman narrate his own thoughts? But you wanted to hear Kevin Conroy talk. And it's that weird bridging that brings the person holding the controller into that conveyance. Were there any other points of development where you're like, I'm not sure, or like a preconceived idea of how you wanted the world to be and the characters to be that kind of you had to make those sort of concessions?
Early on, the story actually was something more that I had done, and I think I got feedback from the majority of the team, who thankfully is willing to give feedback, and they were not liking it at all. They were not big fans of any of it. And I kind of had to take a backseat there, and we got another writer to do the story components of it, which turned out significantly better than anything I had done. So it's having that team that's willing to give you the feedback that also helps to make the thing better in the end.
And that's good. I mean, I feel like a good kind of open discussion on working on a project like that has to exist. Otherwise, you'll never move forward with it. I'm curious, like you mentioned earlier that you had a difficulty in development when you were trying to make it more challenging. How did you find the balance between challenge and accessibility? Because I know, there's a lot of discussion, especially in side-scrolling games, especially games where you can die and come back, and like there's a challenge curve to make it hard enough that it's a challenge, but not so hard that people can't get through it. I imagine early access must have helped with that a bit. You could see where people were dying a lot or where there were difficulty pain points.
Right. One of our goals was to make sure that even if people can't pass a level at the moment, they can upgrade their character through either their skill tree or their equipment upgrades. We wanted to make sure that there was some way to progress your character so that you can get stronger, so that you can move forward through those areas. And we found that even with that, the tuning of the enemies and the system behind how often your character gets into basically a hit stun was too frequent. And we ended up tuning that value quite a bit, decreasing it significantly from what it was in the original builds. And I think that didn't happen until, I want to say, probably 2 to 4 months into early access. I think finally we made that switch. And that was one of the bigger things that really helped with the accessibility of the game.
I wonder with something like Foregone, so it's a big departure from a lot of the games that you've done at Big Blue Bubble. And I'm curious, what is the future of Big Blue Bubble? Do you guys feel like you're going to just be working on Foregone for a while and tweaking it, or maybe DLC? Or are you guys already in talks, not necessarily anything to announce now, but are you guys in talks of working on something else? And is it within the same kind of genre, or you want to branch out? Like, I'm curious, since you guys went from some DS games, mostly mobile games, and now to this awesome action platformer, like what the next steps for Big Blue Bubble looks like.
So our company is, I don't know the exact count, but we're close to 60 to 75-ish employees, somewhere in that realm. And not everyone is working on the same titles. There is the Foregone team. We're working on the upcoming Steam stuff, as well as some other things. But there's also other teams. There's the My Singing Monsters team, who's working on that perpetually. Who knows how long that will keep going. And then there's also some other teams working on some other things. I think we, as a studio, are pretty excited to be working on anything console and PC related. I think it's closer to what a lot of us there are into. But don't get me wrong, we also love our mobile games. I'm still playing those as well. But
And as you said before, something like My Singing Monsters, that has updates, that has a continued community, as mobile games are wont to do. How long after release, after like the final Steam release and everything else, is everyone planning on working on Foregone? Is it going to be a thing of, okay, after a certain point, we're going to have like 2 people just sort of checking in with community, or like what's kind of the plan to put it down and move on to the next thing?
I think part of that is dependent on the community and the general success of the title, but we definitely want to make some more updates. I think it'll depend on how the reaction goes towards our currently planned updates as well. Tough to say.
Yeah, it totally makes sense. I have a very specific question to my nerdy heart. Whose brilliant idea was it to make gun nunchucks as a melee weapon? Because, like,
Gunchucks.
Of all of the weapons I've gotten so far in the game, that was not one I expected to see, but was very excited to see.
That was our producer, Jordan. So he's been pushing those things, I think, for a very long time internally, just because the name was so ridiculous.
They're in his high school notebook somewhere. He's been drawing them for years.
I think everyone kind of scoffed at the idea of them just because it sounded so absolutely ridiculous. And then we had one design meeting where we were deciding on a new weapon of some type. And then he just shouted out gunchucks. And immediately our lead designer kind of lit up, and the rest was history after that. We had to figure out how to make gunchucks a viable weapon in the game.
Hey, look, we live in a world where it's been over a decade since high-heel guns debuted on the PS3 with Bayonetta. We can have gunchucks. We are only limited by our imagination.
Exactly.
I love it.
It's one of those things that I love when a game that's pretty serious, and like, you know, Foregone isn't all doom and gloom, but it's a fairly serious narrative, has a weapon like gunchucks, and it doesn't say anything. Like, the lead character doesn't make a comment. The blacksmith doesn't say anything. Like, they just exist in this world like any other viable weapon, and I kind of appreciate that more.
Right. We didn't make any attempt to make them humorous in any type. You just turn it into a real world thing in the Foregone world, right? You can show one of our producers made a great point of you can make it a aspect of the world without making it a joke by just showing some scene with soldiers training with gunchucks or something else, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And like anyone who has a sense of humor will obviously laugh at the idea of a gunchuck. I think it's meant to be somewhat comical, but it doesn't affect the world or create dissonance because it's just a thing. It just exists. It's kind of like the Scott Pilgrim rule. Like, while Scott Pilgrim is a comedy and very funny, the fighting can be funny, but it's not the fighting that's funny. It's the things that happen in this world, but it's matter of fact. They just exist. And I think when games do that too, it gives such a strong sense of personality because you're like, all right, that's this world. I have nunchucks with guns as the handles. Let's go. Let's kick some butt.
Our only downside to that is we now need to find some way to one-up it in future updates.
Correct. Like, now, do you have a spear with a shotgun on the end? Like, I don't know. Like, if you make that, I just need a shout out. That's fine. You can have it. You can have that idea. Because the spear has become actually my preference for melee weapons. I'm curious, as someone who worked on the game, do you find yourself able to sit and play it and enjoy it as it is, having worked on it? And if you do, what are some of your favorite things about it?
I've still play through it time to time. Whenever a new build is up and we're testing things, I'll sit down and play the build and try to get through it as quickly as possible, typically. I still have fun doing it. I don't have any preference in terms of play style when I play. I think I try to play it like a natural player where what I acquire is what I'll use. And then I kind of try to tailor my build to whatever weapon or bonuses I get through my gear.
That makes sense. I feel like you've played it enough that like to have a preference is hard because you're just like, this is a thing. It's work. I'm moving on. Has working on this game softened you or strengthened your resolve to that kind of game? You've obviously always been a fan of 2D action games, citing back to Mega Man X. Has this just made you want to play more games of that type, or has working on this made you want to play anything but this kind of game?
I think I'm always pretty open to all genres of games. I definitely kind of honed in on side scrollers as we were working on Foregone. I think my wish list on Steam just became this mess of a giant list of platformers that I'm just tracking and paying attention to at this point. I'll still play all of what I can. I think for me, it's just entirely about what gauges my interest in that moment.
Are there any genre of games that some genres for us are, it's like, I'll play any of them unless they're bad. And some are, I just don't play that except a few of these that are good. Like, do you have any of those sort of genres?
I think for me, as I'm getting older now, I'm 32. Fighting games and first-person shooters, I think for me are both hurdles at this point, just because I want to be good at them, and I don't have the reaction time or the time itself to invest to getting it good at them. So it's tough to spend time playing those.
I'll sit at my table, man. I feel that's so hard. I didn't have to get into my 30s to feel that way. I've always felt like that.
Yeah, you're kind of preaching to the choir. I found that if I can play a really great shooter that I like, I'll get sucked in, like Mass Effect although arguably the shooting isn't the best part of Mass Effect, but that's a whole other story. But like something like Destiny, where like Bungie knows how to make a gunplay game, like, it feels tight, it's responsive, it's easy to do. But then I just try and pick up like a Call of Duty and I'm like, I don't understand this. My fingers don't work right for this. Talking about modern games and what your Steam wish list is looking like, are there any games coming up that you're really excited about as of when we're recording, or recent games that you haven't picked up yet but that you're looking forward to playing?
Yeah, I'm kind of in a drought in terms of what I can play, simply because I've been trying to acquire a new video card for my computer. So I'm sitting here waiting to play Assassin's Creed Valhalla. That's one that I've been waiting for quite a while. Cyberpunk's coming up pretty soon for us. I'm excited to try that out.
Truth.
Yep.
On the smaller front, I think it's called Mindseas that is out, and I've been just kind of waiting to try that one out as I finish up a game called Always Sometimes Monsters.
Oh, interesting. What's that one about?
So I met the developer at PAX East, actually, and it was the only reason why this game ever came on my radar. It's actually created in RPG Maker. It's about choices, basically. So it's all real world setting. There's no combat of any type. It's just your character trying to get through a month to reach a friend's wedding, and you're basically making decisions to get through that. I think I'm at the very tail end of it, and probably will finish it after we're done recording here.
Huh. That's amazing. That sounds really fun. I always am blown away by the concepts that people create, and like that indie mega booth was such a great place to be at PAX East. I felt like I discovered so many games that I would have never even known about if not for that area. And like when you guys were at PAX East, did you get time to like wander around a little and take some stuff in?
Since there was 3 of us running the booth, I think our breaks were kind of few and far between, but definitely still took some opportunities to run around and play some stuff. The name escapes me of one of the games I played that I loved, and I feel bad now that I can't give them a proper shout out.
Oh no.
It's okay. If it comes back to you, you can let us know. I mean, I remember, like, of course, Foregone wasn't on my radar until I played it at PAX East, and then Star Renegades, which I've now played a little bit on Xbox Game Pass. Also, I was blown away by at PAX East. Like, I think that, well, and we've talked about this on the show before, while I love looking up stuff online or seeing announcements on Twitter, there's something about just walking through a room full of video games to like take in the kinds of things that you might want to play that you'd never heard of that I think is so much stronger. It just kind of pulls you in.
Right. And then you see the giant crowds gathering at one game and you go, oh, what's this everyone's so excited about? And then you want to go try it out as well. I think that display that Fuser had at the PAX East was unbelievable.
It was insane. And like, I'm someone who is a DJ and a music nerd. And so Fuser's out now and I've been playing it obsessively. And like, I didn't know Fuser existed. And I've talked to a few other people. It turns out like Harmonix didn't say anything. Like they'd been quietly working on Fuser. And then they were like, all right, PAX East is coming up. Maybe we should have a booth. And like when they announced the map, like you could see this Fuser booth, but like they kind of played it low key. And as someone who grew up playing Guitar Hero and Rock Band and even Amplitude and stuff, like it was so exciting to see this thing and then get my hands on it as a DJ. And like, this is exactly what I want. No peripherals, mixing music. And the booth was impressive. It's one of the stages that I think is actually in the game. It's the first stage you're on. They recreated in the middle of PAX East, and it just blew my mind. You have to wonder, does someone at Harmonix like have that in their house, like just in their giant basement, like this giant DJ setup? Like what happens to that thing after they're done with it?
That's the break room now.
Right, exactly.
It's our holiday decorations. I don't know. I'm also a big fan of going to conventions and finding those booths that nobody's there. Because then you get a chance to connect with people and be like, all right, tell me about your game. And not be like, I'll bother them later or whatever. It's just like, hey, let's have that conversation.
Were there any like super small titles that you really liked that you saw at PAX East?
I don't know that we had much time to look at some of the smaller ones at PAX East.
That's fair.
Yeah.
I was at also a different convention earlier back in November of that year. And we were at Mega Migs in Montreal. There was a lot of smaller developers there since it's a lot more indie focused. And it's like you said, that you could see those smaller ones that have a few people there or even nobody, and you can try out the game immediately and have a conversation with the person or people that created that game. I tried one that was Graft, which was almost this game / teaching tool that kind of taught you about pseudocode and coding a character to fight a group of enemies in simple commands, which was very interesting. And talking to that developer was awesome to just hear some of the insights about what went into that.
It's incredible.
That's awesome. That's really cool.
Something I love about indie games in general, it's not even like a recent thing. It's just what indie games are. They can do the ideas that a large studio would sort of go, oh, I don't know, well, maybe not. Gunchucks would have to go through a lot more approval processes to get into a game in a much larger studio. But we're now seeing a lot of cool game experiences like that, like pseudo coding, things that are throwbacks to stuff we remember, but with modern conveniences, or stories that can be told, and always sometimes monsters kind of situation. What intrigues you the most in design or in inspiration? Is it putting forth a certain game experience, or a story that can be told, or a world that people can enter? Game for story, I guess.
I think one of the things we tried to do with Foregone was focus on the gameplay and make sure it's as solid and tight as possible. And I think I'm a fan of that myself a bit more. Although I do love a good story. I think some of my favorite genres or some of my favorite games are in the RPG genre. So It's tough to find that balance. Specifically for Big Blue Bubble developer, I think we focus on the gameplay more.
That makes sense. Well, and I think it's too, like, which one leads the other? You think of a really cool story. Well, what sort of game is that? Nowadays visual novels can do that. I know they've been around forever, but they're a little more popular now. You can have more visual novel elements versus not to harp on the gun nunchucks, but it's a wonderful symbol. But like somebody figures out, ooh, gunchucks. Look at this cool, crazy thing. Well, what is this person doing? What is their world? Like it's leading with the gameplay. Of course, both need to be polished.
For sure. I'm curious, Dino, if you could work on anything, like if you could work on any property, if you could, like Capcom calls you tomorrow and says, hey, we want you to make the next Mega Man game. Like, what's the ideal game that you could work on? Like, obviously, whatever you work on at Big Blue Bubble will be a lot of fun. And like the studio is incredible. But I'm curious what your like dream big game franchise to work on would be.
I think that's tough for me. I think my favorite game usually changes from moment to moment. Like,
oh yeah,
sure.
Yeah, that's really hard. There's a lot of games that have an influence on me growing up. Probably the largest would probably be Final Fantasy. So I'm very excited for 16. That announcement kind of felt out of nowhere.
Hard same.
Yeah, I was kind of blown away by it. And I'm bummed that I haven't gotten to experience 15 yet in full. I played, I think, about 10 hours of it, and I just think something else came out. But yeah, I think we're all around the same age. And like Final Fantasy VII hit in a way that I feel like a lot of other video games just didn't hit. Just the way it looked, the way it sounded, the story, all of it. And I think it's hard to not be influenced by something as big as that, because it kind of changed how RPGs were viewed, because I feel like JRPGs especially were more niche before 7, and I could be pulling that out of my ass a little bit, but like I feel like it was a bigger media event than games had been before.
I'd say so. It changed how games were advertised. I don't think anything had that large of an advertising budget before. I know they pushed stuff. I got friends who still got their VHS tape talking about Donkey Kong Country, but Final Fantasy VII was something different.
Are there any games that you remember from your past, that you haven't played that you're like, oh, I should get around to that sometime, or that like really stand out, like a game you maybe really regret that you missed?
So I did try to go back and play Symphony of the Night many, many times at this point, and it's still one that I always pick up. I play a little bit, I get into it a couple of days, and then I stop for whatever reason I can't even identify. So at some point still, I really want to just sit down, play Symphony of the Night, and complete it so that I can say I've played that game, which I feel like is a prerequisite for working on side scrollers anyways.
Yeah, that's legit. Yeah, I think that and we've talked about this on the show too a bit, like there's so much stuff that it feels overwhelming sometimes. Do you sometimes feel burned out by games because you work in games and then you play games? Like, do you feel sometimes like you need to do anything but play a video game?
I typically try to keep a pretty good balance, I think. I watch a lot of movies, TV shows. I read pretty frequently, almost every night. And then we're in such a good time in gaming where there's so many different things coming out, from the smallest developer, from one-man teams to huge now quad A games, right? Yeah, so right. I think there's so much variety that it's hard to feel burnt out. If you want to play something short and simple, you can do that now. If you want to play a 70-hour AAA RPG, you can go do that as well.
That's true, yeah.
All right, we're in a good time for that.
Before we wrap up, I would love for you to just kind of give the short version sales pitch on Foregone, where, since no one's going to be more suited to talk about it than you, and then where folks can find the game, find it on the internet, and find you on the internet. So
Foregone is, the best way to put it is, it's an action RPG mixed with a side scroller, story driven entirely. We want players to finish the game and feel like that they've created a unique build of their own character. Customization is there. We want systems that support players to create their own experience going through this story-based game. And you can find it pretty much anywhere at this point. It's on the Epic Games Store. It's on Nintendo Switch, PlayStation 4, Xbox One.
Excellent. Nice. Awesome. And I actually have a question that maybe you can answer. Is it going to be available as a backwards compatibility option on the newer consoles? Do you know if that's the case?
I'm not 100% certain on this, but I believe it is.
Okay. So don't take Dino's word for it. Maybe go check the site, but it's good to know.
It's good to check out.
Dino, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us. I really love this game so much. As someone who grew up playing these kinds of games and doesn't shut up on the show about these kinds of games, Foregone just felt like a love letter to, and I didn't see it before, but to Mega Man X and games like that. Even with the heaviness of the story in a very brightly colored world, like there is a lot of similarities. So thank you for being a part of making this incredible game.
Thank you for enjoying it as much as you have, and thank you for having me.
Yeah, no worries. Well, listeners, have you played Foregone yet? What do you think about it? If you haven't, are you excited to play it now? I haven't really played it. I'm super excited now to play it, like extremely. This is, I need to go do, that's what I'm doing with my day today.
Sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. And have you played any of Big Blue Bubble's mobile games? Do you have any feelings on those? We want to know.
Yes, please let us know. You can find us on Twitter at funandgamespod. You can email us at funandgamespod@gmail.com. You can also go to our website, certainpov.com, where us and a ton of other really great nerdy podcasts are. You can join our Discord server, where we have tons of different folks talking about all sorts of different stuff. And we would love to hear from you. Also, if you have a moment, head over to iTunes or whatever podcast platform of your choice and write us a quick review. It helps us to get featured and noticed. We want to grow and share games with everybody, especially our love of games. So please, please, please write us a review. Thanks.
And any way that you can be part of this conversation, we encourage, we welcome, because this is a conversation. Thank you for being a part of it. I'm Geoff Moonen.
And I'm Matt A.K. Stormageddon.
And happy gaming.
Hey there, Screen Beans. Have you heard about Screen Snark?
Rachel, this is an ad break. They aren't Screen Beans until they listen to the show.
Fine. Potential Screen Beans. You like movies and TV shows, right?
I mean, who doesn't? Screen Snark is a casual conversation about the movies and television shows that are shaping us as we live our everyday lives.
That's right, Matt. We have a chat with at least one incredible guest every episode, hailing from all walks. We've interviewed chefs,
writers, costumers, musicians,
yoga teachers, comedians, burlesque dancers,
folks in the film and TV industry,
and more.
We'd be delighted for you to join us every other Monday on the Certain POV Podcast Network.
Or wherever you get your podcasts, fresh and tasty off the presses.
What? That's not.
Can I call them Screen Beans now?
Fine.
Screen Beans.
So tune in and we'll see you at the movies or on a couch somewhere.
'Cause you're all Screen Beans now.
You will be mine.
CPOV. CertainPOV.com.